In the heart of New York City, an elderly woman collapses in the middle of a busy street, ignored by the rushing crowd. But when Barron Trump steps forward, everything changes. As he holds her trembling hand, she whispers a heartbreaking secret that sets off a journey of forgiveness, redemption, and an emotional reunion you won't believe. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The afternoon air in New York City was thick with the rhythm of a city that never stopped moving. Horns blared, footsteps echoed against the concrete, and a sea of people rushed through the streets, each lost in their own world. No one noticed the frail figure of Margaret Hayes, her thin frame trembling as she clutched a plastic shopping bag. Her steps were slow, hesitant, as if every movement required an effort greater than she could afford. She had been walking for what felt like hours, her energy draining with each block she covered. The weight of her years bore down on her shoulders, but the weight of her past was heavier. With every uncertain step, she thought of her destination, a place she wasn't even sure existed anymore, a face she hadn't seen in over a decade. Then it happened. As she reached the middle of the bustling crosswalk, her knees buckled. A sudden dizziness overtook her, the world spinning in a blur of colors and movement. Her breath hitched, and before she could call for help, her legs gave out. She collapsed onto the unforgiving asphalt, her belongings scattering around her like fallen leaves. A can of soup rolled away, a small loaf of bread landed near the curb, and a worn-out photograph slipped from her grasp, carried by the wind before settling near the feet of onlookers. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and for a brief moment, the relentless rush of the city hesitated. The traffic light changed, but cars screeched to a stop just inches from her frail body. And then, silence. People stood frozen, eyes darting between one another, as if waiting for someone else to make the first move. Some clutched their phones, uncertain whether to call for help or keep walking. Others stepped back, unwilling to get involved. The urgency of the moment clashed with the indifference of the city. No one knew her, no one had the time. But then, a voice rose above the hesitation. From the sidewalk, Barron Trump stood watching, his tall frame tense with focus. Unlike the others, he didn't hesitate. Without a second thought, he stepped off the curb and into the street. His security detail immediately reacted. "Sir, step back," one of them warned, reaching for his arm. But Barron ignored them. He pushed forward, breaking through the invisible barrier of hesitation that held the crowd back. Kneeling beside Margaret, he placed a firm but gentle hand on her shoulder. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" His voice was calm, controlled, but laced with urgency. Margaret's eyes fluttered open, her gaze unfocused. Her lips parted, but no words came, only a soft, shaky whisper. "Help me." His security team moved in, forming a barrier between Barron and the growing crowd. One of them urged, "Sir, we need to move you out of the street." But Barron didn't move. His focus was only on the woman before him. He shrugged off his jacket and carefully placed it under her head, offering her a comfort that no one else had thought to give. The crowd murmured in disbelief. "That's Barron Trump. What is he doing?" someone whispered. But Barron wasn't thinking about who he was or what people expected of him. He was thinking about the woman trembling beneath his hands, the fear in her fading blue eyes, and the soft whimper of pain escaping her lips. Margaret's hand reached out, trembling as she clutched the sleeve of his shirt. Her breath was shallow. She tried to speak, but only a few words came through. "My heart, my son." Barron felt a chill run through him. He tightened his grip on her frail hand. "Stay with me," he urged. Sirens wailed in the distance, cutting through the tension. Help was on the way. But Barron had a feeling that this was only the beginning. The sirens grew louder, their wailing cries piercing through the thick hum of the city. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the glass windows of towering buildings, illuminating the frozen expressions of onlookers. The world seemed to have slowed, the rhythmic urgency of the city breaking for just a moment, as all eyes remained locked on the figure kneeling in the middle of the street. Barron Trump, holding the frail hand of Margaret Hayes, refusing to let go. Barron's jaw tightened as he assessed the woman's condition. Her breathing was uneven, her fingers trembling within his grasp. The weight of her words, "My heart, my son," pressed heavily on him. He could see it in her eyes, the silent fear that stretched beyond just the pain she was feeling now. It was a fear laced with regret, longing, and an unspoken sorrow that made Barron's chest tighten. Behind him, his security team remained on high alert. The lead agent, Carter, leaned in close. "Sir, the paramedics are 30 seconds out. We need to clear the area." Barron shook his head. "Not yet." A sharp honk from an impatient taxi driver shattered the moment, jolting the onlookers out of their trance. A few bystanders began recording on their phones, whispering among themselves. "Why is he still with her? Most people would have left by now." Barron ignored the murmurs, his focus unwavering. He spotted something near Margaret's scattered belongings, a small, faded photograph, half covered in dirt. Reaching over, he picked it up carefully, dusting it off with his sleeve. His gaze softened as he studied the image. It was old, the edges curling from years of wear. A young woman, Margaret in her youth, held a smiling baby boy in her arms, her eyes filled with the kind of happiness that could only come from unconditional love. Barron turned back to Margaret, holding the photo where she could see it. "Is this your son?" he asked gently. A tear slipped down the woman's cheek as her lips parted in a whisper. "Michael?" Barron felt a lump form in his throat. He had expected the answer, but hearing the name from her lips made it real. He didn't know who Michael was, but he knew that wherever he was, he mattered to Margaret more than anything in the world. The ambulance finally arrived, screeching to a halt just feet away. The paramedics jumped out, pushing through the crowd with swift efficiency. Barron stepped back slightly to give them space, but Margaret's grip on his sleeve tightened in desperation. "Please," she murmured, her eyes pleading. "Don't let me die before I see him again." Barron inhaled sharply. It wasn't just fear in her voice, it was regret. It was sorrow. It was the sound of a mother who had carried the weight of a mistake for years, terrified that she wouldn't have the chance to make it right. One of the paramedics, a woman named Laura, knelt beside Margaret, quickly assessing her vitals. "She's experiencing symptoms of cardiac distress. We need to transport her now." Margaret's eyes flickered with panic, her grip on Barron unrelenting. "Michael," she whispered again. Barron's mind raced. He had no idea who Michael was or where he might be, but he knew that finding him wasn't just an afterthought, it was a matter of life and death. As the paramedics prepared to lift Margaret onto the stretcher, Barron leaned in close, his voice steady but filled with quiet intensity. "I promise. I'll find him." Margaret let out a shaky breath, her tears spilling freely now. With the last bit of strength she had, she squeezed his hand in gratitude. "Thank you." The paramedics loaded her into the ambulance, securing the doors before the vehicle sped off into the distance, sirens wailing once more. The crowd, which had been holding its collective breath, finally exhaled, the tension breaking like a wave crashing against the shore. But for Barron, it wasn't over. He turned to Carter, his expression unreadable, his voice firm. "We need to find her son." Carter hesitated. "Sir, we don't even have a last name, no address, no leads." Barron pulled the faded photograph from his pocket, his grip tightening around the fragile piece of paper. "Then we start with this." Without another word, he turned toward his SUV, his mind already racing ahead. He had no idea where this journey would lead him, but one thing was certain: he wasn't walking away from this. Not now. Not when it mattered most. The city stretched out before Barron Trump, a maze of possibilities, secrets, and lost time. The faded photograph of Margaret Hayes and her son Michael remained clutched in his hand as he sat in the back seat of his black SUV. Outside, the world moved on. Pedestrians rushed through crowded streets, cab drivers honked in frustration, and business people stared at their phones, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded just hours earlier. But for Barron, time had narrowed to one singular mission: finding Michael before it was too late. The weight of Margaret's words still echoed in his mind. "Don't let me die before I see him again." He couldn't shake the desperation in her voice, the way her fragile hand had clung to his as if he were her last tether to hope. He had promised her he would find Michael, and a promise was something Barron Trump did not take lightly. His security team sat in silence, waiting for instructions. Carter, his most trusted guard, cleared his throat. "Sir, we have very little to go on. The hospital confirmed that Margaret Hayes is stable for now, but we don't have a full name for her son, no last known address, nothing." Barron exhaled, rolling his shoulders back. "We start where she collapsed," he said firmly, his voice unwavering. "Someone in that area must have seen her before. If she was searching for her son, she didn't just appear there by accident." Carter nodded and relayed the orders to the driver. The SUV made a sharp turn, heading back to the intersection where Margaret had collapsed just hours earlier. The scene was now clear. The traffic had resumed. The sidewalks were once again filled with people who had moved on with their day, but Barron hadn't. He couldn't. As they parked, Barron stepped out of the car, scanning the area. He approached the small convenience store on the corner. The bell above the door jingled as he entered, and the scent of fresh coffee and old newspapers filled the air. Behind the counter stood an older man with a thick mustache, wearing a faded blue apron. His name tag read Frank. Frank barely glanced up from the register as Barron approached. "Help you with something?" he asked in a gruff voice. Barron placed the photograph on the counter, tapping it gently. "Have you seen this woman before?" Frank squinted at the image before letting out a soft sigh. "Yeah, she's been around the last couple of weeks, always looking at this same picture, mumbling something about her son. Never caused trouble, just seemed lost." Barron's pulse quickened. "Did she ever mention where she was going? Did she talk to anyone?" Frank leaned on the counter, thinking for a moment. "There was a guy she spoke to a few times. A young man, worked at the auto shop 2 blocks down. I think she asked him if he knew her son." Barron didn't waste a second. He grabbed the photograph and nodded. "Thank you." Then he turned to Carter. "Let's go." The auto shop was a modest, run-down building with faded paint and an old neon sign that flickered weakly. Inside, the scent of motor oil and gasoline filled the air. Mechanics bustled around, working on cars lifted onto platforms, their overalls stained with grease. Barron stepped in, drawing immediate attention. A young man with dark hair and a skeptical expression looked up from the hood of a car. He wiped his hands on a rag and approached cautiously. "You lost, man?" he asked, sizing Barron up. Barron pulled out the photograph once again. "I'm looking for a man named Michael Hayes. I was told an elderly woman came here asking about him." The young mechanic's face darkened instantly. He stiffened, his eyes darting toward the back of the shop before he quickly masked his reaction. "Never heard of him," he said, too quickly. Barron didn't buy it. He had seen enough lies in his lifetime to recognize one when it was right in front of him. "Look," Barron said, his voice firm but not unkind, "I don't have time for games. That woman is in the hospital. She's been searching for her son for years. If you know something, now's the time to speak up." The mechanic hesitated, his fingers tightening around the rag in his hands. Finally, he exhaled sharply and nodded toward the back door. "Come with me." Barron followed him through the shop, stepping out into an alley where the noise of the city was muffled. The mechanic crossed his arms and leaned against the wall. "His name is Daniel Hayes," the mechanic finally admitted. "He used to work here before things went south. I don't know what happened between him and his mother, but I know he's got a lot of anger in him. He doesn't talk about his past." Barron's heart pounded. Daniel Hayes. He had a name. "Where is he now?" Barron asked. The mechanic hesitated. "There's a bar down on 8th Street. Sometimes he stops by after work. If you want to find him, that's your best bet." Barron nodded. "Thank you." The SUV was waiting for him outside. As Barron climbed in, Carter studied him carefully. "Sir, are you sure about this? We're talking about a man who's been estranged from his mother for years. He may not react well." Barron's expression was unreadable. He deserves to know the truth. Whether he chooses to see her or not, that's up to him. The bar was exactly what Barron expected. A dimly lit place filled with men who had seen hard times. The smell of beer, cigarettes, and cheap cologne filled the air. Conversations hummed in low tones, the occasional burst of laughter breaking through the tension. Barron spotted him immediately. Sitting at the far end of the bar, hunched over a drink, was a man in his mid-30s with unkempt hair and tired eyes. Daniel Hayes. His hands were rough, calloused from years of manual labor, and his posture screamed of someone who had given up on second chances. Barron approached with measured steps, stopping just beside him. "Daniel Hayes?" Michael turned slowly, his expression wary. His gaze flickered over Barron, recognizing him immediately. "Oh, great," he muttered, rubbing his temple. "What does the president's kid want with me?" Barron ignored the sarcasm. He pulled the photograph from his pocket and set it on the bar. Michael's body went rigid. His eyes locked onto the image, his grip tightening around his drink. His jaw clenched, his breathing uneven. "She's been looking for you," Barron said, his voice calm. "She collapsed in the street today. She's in the hospital now." Michael's fingers hovered over the photograph, his emotions battling beneath the surface. Years of resentment, pain, regret. "She left me," he finally said, his voice hollow. "She made her choices." Barron studied him carefully, and now she's fighting for her life, hoping for one last chance to make things right. Michael exhaled sharply, his fists clenching. He didn't move for a long moment. Then, without a word, he grabbed his coat and stood up. "Take me to her," he said. Barron nodded, leading him out of the bar. The road to healing had begun. The ride to St. Mary's Hospital was silent, heavy with unspoken words. Daniel Hayes sat in the back of the SUV, his fingers tapping against his knee, his eyes locked on the city lights passing by. His body was tense, his thoughts a storm he couldn't quiet. Barron Trump, seated beside him, studied his expression carefully. He had seen many emotions in people: arrogance, fear, guilt, but Michael's face was carved from something deeper: pain, anger, and the weight of regret. Barron understood this wasn't just a reunion, it was a confrontation with the past. 15 years of silence, 15 years of questions, 15 years of a mother and son drifting further apart, until all that remained was a void of hurt and bitterness. And now, in the quiet hum of the vehicle, that past was catching up to Michael fast. "She never stopped looking for you," Barron finally said, breaking the silence. Michael exhaled through his nose, jaw tightening. He didn't turn his head. "That doesn't change anything," he muttered. Barron frowned but remained patient. "Maybe, but it means something." Michael's fingers curled into a fist, resting against his thigh. "What do you expect me to do?" His voice was low, cautious, as if bracing himself for the answer. Barron turned to him fully. "That's up to you." Michael scoffed, shaking his head. "You don't know what it was like," he said, his voice thick with resentment. "My mom, Margaret, she worked all the time, always on her feet, always too tired. We barely spoke, and when we did, we fought. I was angry all the time, and she just let me go." His throat bobbed, and he clenched his fists tighter. "I packed a bag, walked out, and never looked back. You think I didn't wait for her to come after me? She never did." Barron remained quiet, letting the words settle. He understood now. Michael's resentment wasn't just about abandonment. It was about the waiting, the silence, the hope that never came. The SUV slowed as they neared the hospital. Barron turned back to Michael. "I won't tell you what to do," he said, his voice softer now. "But she's lying in that bed right now, and she's been carrying the same weight as you. She's been waiting too." Michael said nothing. His fingers twitched against his knee. The car pulled to a stop in front of the hospital, and Carter opened the door. Michael hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping out. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and faintly of coffee. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as they walked through the halls. Room 214 was just ahead. Michael's steps slowed, his chest rising and falling in steady, shallow breaths. Barron placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to have the perfect words. Just go." Michael swallowed hard. His feet felt like lead, but he moved forward, pushing the door open. Inside, Margaret Hayes lay against the white pillows, her frail frame seeming even smaller beneath the hospital blanket. Her eyes were closed, her breathing steady but weak. The machines beside her beeped softly, filling the quiet. For a moment, Michael just stood there. Margaret stirred. Then, as if sensing something, she opened her eyes slowly. Her gaze was dazed at first, then sharpened as it locked onto him. Michael felt something twist deep inside his chest. "Michael." Margaret's voice was barely a whisper, but it hit him like a wave. He hesitated at the threshold, fingers twitching at his sides. She looked so much older than he remembered, more fragile. Time had not been kind. "You came," she breathed, her eyes filling with tears. Michael cleared his throat, shifting his weight uncomfortably. His voice cracked slightly. "Yeah, I'm here." Tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks. I thought I lost you forever." Michael swallowed again, the lump in his throat tightening. He had promised himself he wouldn't cry. He had spent years convincing himself that she didn't care, that she had moved on. But the raw emotion in her face, the sheer relief, undid something inside of him. He stopped, exhaling hard, dragging a hand through his hair. "You didn't come after me," he finally said. His voice was sharper than he intended, but he needed to say it. "I walked out that door, and you just let me go." Margaret's face crumpled. "I never wanted to let you go," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But I thought you didn't want me to." Michael's breath hitched. I was scared," Margaret continued. "Scared that if I tried to find you, you'd turn me away. That you hated me too much to even look at me." Michael turned away for a moment, rubbing a hand over his face. His mind was at war with itself. Part of him wanted to yell, to demand why it took her this long, but another part, a much louder part, wanted to forgive. Barron stood near the doorway, watching the reunion unfold with quiet respect. This was not his moment. This was theirs. Margaret reached for Michael's hand. "I love you," she whispered. "I always have. I always will." Michael exhaled shakily. This was the moment that could go either way, the moment that could end with more years of separation or healing. His fingers trembled as he finally reached forward and took her hand. "I missed you, Mom," he admitted, his voice raw. Margaret let out a quiet sob, her fingers tightening around his. "I missed you more than you'll ever know." Barron felt his chest tighten, a lump forming in his throat. This was why he came. This was why he had pushed Michael to come. Because sometimes, all it takes is one moment of courage to change everything. The hospital room was silent except for the rhythmic beeping of the machines and the faint hum of the city outside. Margaret Hayes lay back against the pillows, her fingers still wrapped tightly around Michael's hand, as though afraid he might disappear again. The years had taken their toll, lines of worry etched deep into her face, her once strong hands now frail and thin. But in that moment, she was no longer just an elderly woman in a hospital bed. She was a mother reunited with the son she thought she had lost forever. Michael had spent the last 15 years convincing himself that she had moved on, that she hadn't cared enough to fight for him. Yet now, as he sat beside her, her tear-filled eyes searching his as if to memorize every detail, he saw something else. A lifetime of regret, a desperate longing, and the kind of love that time couldn't erase. Michael cleared his throat, but his voice still came out rough. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again." Margaret gave him a weak smile, her fingers squeezing his. "I didn't think you'd want to." Michael exhaled hard and ran a hand over his face, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He had imagined this moment in so many ways: angry, bitter confrontations, or cold, distant reunions where they barely spoke. But he had never imagined this. The quiet, painful realization that love had never left them, even when they had left each other. Barron, standing near the doorway, observed the scene with quiet respect. He knew his role in this was done. He had opened the door, but it was up to them to step through it. Margaret reached out with trembling fingers and brushed them over Michael's cheek, her eyes misty with emotion. "You look just like your father," she murmured. "Except your eyes. You have mine." Michael swallowed, emotions thick in his throat. He hadn't thought about his father in years, the man who had walked out on them when he was still too young to understand what abandonment meant. He had spent his entire life believing his mother had done the same. But now, looking at her, he realized she had never truly left. She had just been lost, just like him. "I was angry for a long time," Michael admitted. I thought if I left first, it wouldn't hurt as much." Margaret let out a shaky breath. "And I thought if I let you go, maybe you'd find happiness somewhere else. But I was wrong. Letting you go was the worst mistake of my life." Michael's jaw clenched as he forced himself to meet her gaze. "Why didn't you come after me?" The question came out harsher than he intended, but he had to ask. He had carried it in his chest for too long. Margaret's lips trembled and she took a breath before answering. "I was scared," she admitted. "Scared that you wouldn't want me anymore. That I had already failed you beyond repair. I searched, Michael. I swear I did. But you had vanished, and when I finally thought I had a way to find you, I told myself it was too late, that maybe you were better off without me." Michael turned his head away, his jaw tightening. That was the worst part of it all, how easily people convinced themselves they weren't wanted. He had done it too, convincing himself that if his mother hadn't chased after him, then she hadn't loved him. And she had convinced herself that if she did chase after him, he would turn her away. Barron saw the tension in Michael's body, the unspoken war inside him. He took a step forward and placed a firm hand on Michael's shoulder. "You're here now," Barron said quietly. "That's what matters." Michael looked over at him, then back at his mother. Margaret let out a breath she had been holding and smiled through her tears. "Barron's right. You're here, and I'll spend whatever time I have left making up for the years we lost. If you'll let me." Michael hesitated. Could he? Could he let her back into his life after so much time, after so much pain? But when he looked into her eyes, eyes that had once tucked him in at night, that had watched over him when he was sick, that had given him all the love she had, even when she had nothing else to give, he knew the answer. "I want that too," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to do this, but I don't want to waste any more time." Margaret let out a sob and pulled him into a weak but fierce embrace. Michael hesitated for only a second before wrapping his arms around her. For the first time in 15 years, he allowed himself to be her son again. Barron stepped back, giving them space. He felt a lump rise in his throat, though he quickly swallowed it down. He hadn't done this for recognition or thanks. He had done it because he believed in moments like this. Moments where people chose love over anger, healing over pain. After a few minutes, Margaret pulled back, wiping her tears. She turned to Barron, her expression full of gratitude. "You made this possible," she whispered. Barron shook his head. "I just brought him here," he said simply. "The rest was all you." Margaret smiled, and for the first time, it reached her eyes. A nurse knocked on the door softly, interrupting the moment. "Mrs. Hayes, I need to run a few more tests." Margaret sighed but nodded. Michael stood, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'll come back tomorrow," he promised. Margaret's smile widened. "I'd like that." As Michael and Barron left the hospital room, they walked in silence for a while. It wasn't awkward, it was contemplative, heavy with the weight of everything that had just happened. When they reached the hospital exit, Michael finally spoke. "I don't know how to thank you," he admitted, "for pushing me to come here, for not letting me run away again." Barron offered a small smile. "You did all the hard parts," he said. Michael chuckled, shaking his head. "I don't think I would have, not without you." He hesitated before adding, "You didn't have to do any of this. You don't even know me." Barron shrugged. "Maybe not. But I know what it's like to be misunderstood, to feel like the world has already decided who you are before you even get the chance to prove them wrong." Michael studied him for a moment, as if seeing him in a new light. "You're not what I expected," he admitted. Barron laughed lightly. "I get that a lot." Michael smirked, then extended a hand. "Thank you, man, for everything." Barron took it without hesitation. As Michael walked away, Barron watched him go, knowing that something had changed today. Not just for Michael and Margaret, but for himself as well. Because sometimes, the biggest difference a person can make isn't through speeches or grand gestures. It's through small, quiet moments. A simple push in the right direction. A reminder that love is always worth fighting for. The next morning, the hospital hummed with quiet activity. Nurses bustled from room to room, doctors made their rounds, and families visited their loved ones. But in room 214, something far more profound than a routine checkup was unfolding. Daniel Hayes stood outside the hospital door, staring at the handle as though it weighed 1,000 pounds. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. Why was this so difficult? He had promised his mother he would return, but as he stood there, the old wounds in his heart reopened. The years of anger, the pain of feeling abandoned, it all came rushing back. What if today wasn't like yesterday? What if she changed her mind? What if he changed his? A voice interrupted his thoughts. "You planning to go in, or are you just going to stand there all day?" Michael turned sharply to see Barron Trump leaning casually against the hallway wall, arms crossed, a knowing smirk playing on his lips. The young man had been waiting, just in case Michael needed that extra push. Michael exhaled sharply. "I don't know, man. Yesterday was a lot. What if we can't get back what we lost?" Barron shrugged, pushing himself off the wall. "Maybe you don't get it back. Maybe you build something new, but you won't know until you walk through that door." Michael let out a nervous chuckle. "You're pretty wise for a rich kid." Barron laughed. "Yeah, well, let's just say I've spent a lot of time thinking about second chances." Michael took a deep breath and turned the handle. Inside, Margaret Harper sat upright in her hospital bed, her frail body looking slightly stronger than the day before. The color in her cheeks had returned, and despite the IV attached to her arm, she smiled warmly at the sight of her son stepping into the room. "You came," she whispered, as though she hadn't been sure he really would. Michael sat in the chair beside her, rubbing his hands together, his nervous energy palpable. "I said I would." She reached for his hand, and this time, he didn't hesitate. He let her fingers wrap around his, the warmth of her touch surprising him. "I didn't think I'd ever get to see you again," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. Michael swallowed hard. "Me neither." They sat in silence for a long moment, both unsure of how to bridge the years of separation. It was Margaret who finally spoke, her voice hesitant. Do you have a family of your own, Michael?" Michael hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "No," he admitted. "Never settled down. I guess I never really saw myself as the type." Margaret's eyes filled with sadness. "Because of me?" Michael clenched his jaw, looking away. He wanted to lie, to tell her that her absence had nothing to do with the way he lived his life. But the truth sat heavy on his chest. "I don't know," he muttered. "Maybe, I think when you walked away, I figured if my own mother could leave, then anyone could." Margaret let out a soft sob, covering her mouth with her frail hands. "I didn't want to leave you," she said, her voice cracking. "I never wanted you to feel like you weren't enough." Michael exhaled sharply, raking a hand through his hair. "I know that now, but back then, it felt like I was just someone else you let go of." Barron remained by the door, watching the conversation unfold with a quiet intensity. He wasn't part of this moment, not really, but he felt its weight. So many people carried pain like this, the pain of what was lost, of what could never be undone. But it was what they did with that pain that mattered. Margaret sniffled, wiping her eyes. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Michael. I want you to know that I have loved you every single day of my life, even when I was too afraid to face you. I never stopped loving you." Michael's throat tightened. He had spent years resenting his mother, painting her as the villain in his story. But sitting here, watching her fight for every word, he realized something. She had been just as lost as he was. He let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "I don't think it's about forgiveness," he said finally. "I think it's about figuring out where we go from here." Margaret's face softened with relief, and for the first time in years, there was something between them other than pain. There was possibility. The moment was interrupted by a knock on the door. A nurse peeked in, holding a clipboard. "Mrs. Harper, your test results came in. The doctor would like to go over them with you." Margaret's smile faltered slightly, but she nodded. "Of course." Michael squeezed her hand before standing. "I'll step out for a bit, let you talk with the doctor." Margaret looked up at him with hopeful eyes. "You'll come back?" Michael nodded. "Yeah, I'll be back." As he and Barron stepped into the hallway, the weight of the moment hung between them. Michael ran a hand over his face, shaking his head. "That was a lot." Barron smirked. "Yeah, well, families tend to be messy like that." Michael let out a dry chuckle. "No kidding." He exhaled slowly. "But I think I want to give this a shot. I don't know how to be a son anymore, but I don't want to waste what time we have left." Barron clapped a hand on his shoulder. "That's all she wants, Michael. Just time." Michael nodded. He had spent too long running, too long avoiding the pain instead of facing it. But now, standing here, he realized something even more terrifying than forgiving his mother was the thought of never getting this chance at all. As he walked toward the exit, he turned back to Barron. "Hey, thank you for everything." Barron just smiled. "Just don't make me drag you back here again." Michael laughed, a real laugh, the first in a long time. As he stepped out into the city air, he felt something shift inside him. He wasn't healed, not yet, but for the first time in years, he felt like he had taken a step toward something real, toward something that mattered, and he had Barron Trump to thank for that. Daniel Hayes sat on a bench outside St. Mary's Hospital, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together as he stared at the city buzzing around him. New York had never felt this quiet before, even with its honking taxis and endless chatter. But inside him, a storm raged. Could he really do this? Could he allow himself to rebuild something that had been broken for so long? He heard the hospital doors slide open behind him. The familiar presence of Barron Trump settled beside him. Neither of them spoke at first. Barron had a way of letting silence do the work, of letting emotions unfold without pressure. Michael appreciated that. Finally, Michael exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "It's crazy, you know. One minute I was living my life, working on cars, keeping my head down, and then I see you standing in my garage, telling me my mother is in the hospital." He scoffed. "Now I feel like my whole life just flipped upside down." Barron smirked. "Yeah, that tends to happen when you come face to face with something you've been running from." Michael shook his head, chuckling darkly. 15 years, man, 15 years of anger. I thought it was easier to just let it be. But when I saw her in that bed," he trailed off, his throat tightening. She had looked so small, so fragile. And yet, she had carried his absence all these years, just like he had carried hers. Barron studied him for a moment before asking, "So what happens now?" Michael sighed. I don't know. I want to be there for her, but I don't know how. I've spent so long convincing myself I didn't need her, and now, he looked up at the sky as if searching for an answer. Now, I feel like I'm learning how to be a son all over again. Barron leaned back, stretching his long legs in front of him. No one expects you to have all the answers, Michael. Not even her. But she's here. You're here. That's all that matters. Michael nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. Maybe Barron was right. Maybe it wasn't about fixing everything overnight. Maybe it was just about showing up. Just then, a nurse stepped outside. Mr. Harper? Michael turned, standing quickly. Yeah, your mother is asking for you. Michael felt his heart jump to his throat, but he nodded. I'll be right there. Barron clapped him on the shoulder. Go, she needs you. Michael took a deep breath and walked back inside, his feet feeling heavier with every step. By the time he reached room 214, his pulse was hammering in his ears. He pushed open the door and found his mother sitting up in bed, looking better than before. There was a tiredness in her eyes, but also something else. Hope. Margaret Harper smiled as he walked in. Michael, she breathed, like she still couldn't believe he was really there. Michael sat beside her, feeling awkward but determined. You feeling better? She nodded. A little, but having you here makes all the difference. Michael swallowed hard. I've been thinking about us, about everything. Margaret reached for his hand and he let her take it. Me too, she whispered. He let out a shaky breath. I don't know how to fix this, Mom. I don't know how to just move on from everything. She squeezed his hand. We don't have to move on from it, Michael. We just have to move forward, together. For the first time in years, Michael felt something lift off his chest. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, he was willing to find out. As they sat there reconnecting in the quiet of the hospital room, Barron Trump watched from the doorway. He didn't need to say anything. This was their moment, their journey to take. And it was just beginning. Days passed, and Margaret Harper's condition steadily improved. The frail, trembling woman Barron Trump had met on the street was now sitting upright in her hospital bed, eating full meals, and even laughing softly at Michael's dry humor. The transformation was subtle but profound. It wasn't just her health that was healing, it was her heart. Michael had been at her bedside every day since that first difficult reunion. He would bring her magazines, tell her stories about his job at the garage, and sometimes just sit there, listening as she spoke about the years they had lost. They didn't shy away from the pain, nor did they dwell on it. Instead, they chose to rebuild. Barron watched their relationship mend with quiet satisfaction. He visited every evening after wrapping up his other obligations, sitting in on their conversations but never intruding. He had done his part. Now it was up to them to make the most of their second chance. One afternoon, as Barron arrived at the hospital, he found Michael standing by the window of his mother's room, staring outside with a pensive look on his face. You okay? Barron asked, leaning against the doorframe. Michael sighed, running a hand through his hair. Yeah, just thinking. Barron raised an eyebrow. Dangerous? Michael let out a short laugh before shaking his head. I keep asking myself why I let it take so long. Why I wasted so many years being angry instead of just picking up the phone. He exhaled heavily. I thought I was punishing her, but really, I was just punishing myself. Barron crossed his arms, nodding. That's how it usually goes, but you're here now, and so is she. That's what matters. Michael turned to look at his mother, who was resting but looked peaceful. Yeah, I guess I just don't want to waste any more time. Barron clapped him on the shoulder. Then Margaret stirred, her eyes fluttering open. When she saw both of them standing there, she smiled. Am I interrupting something? Michael chuckled. Not at all. She reached out her hand, and without hesitation, Michael took it. You know, she said softly, if someone had told me a week ago that I'd be sitting here, holding my son's hand again. I wouldn't have believed them. Michael's grip tightened just a little. I wouldn't have either, he admitted. But I'm glad we're here. Barron watched as mother and son found peace in each other again, and he knew that whatever happened next, they were going to be okay. As he stepped back, ready to leave them to their moment, Margaret turned to him with warmth in her eyes. Barron, you've done more for us than I can ever thank you for. He shook his head. I just helped open the door. You two walked through it. Margaret smiled, her eyes shining. Still, I'll never forget it. Neither would he. Because sometimes the simplest act of kindness could change lives forever. This story is a powerful reminder that kindness and second chances can change lives. Barron Trump didn't just help an elderly woman, he became the bridge that reunited a mother and son who had been separated by time, pain, and regret. In today's fast-pacing world, it's easy to look away from someone in need, to assume it's not our problem. But what if one small act of compassion could alter the course of someone's life? We all carry wounds from the past, but this story shows that it's never too late to heal, to forgive, and to reconnect with those we love. Take a moment today to reach out to someone you've lost touch with. You never know how much it could mean. If this story moved you, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others. Let's spread a message of hope, love, and second chances.